Okay, thanks for the invite, Mark. I guess how this came about was through a discussion earlier in the year where Mark suggested that there's been a lot happening around, I guess, GAIT assessment and that kind of area over the last little while, but he wanted to extend beyond that and specifically into how do we go about changing running technique and I guess why we would want to in the first place. So that's where this kind of, I guess, presentation has spawned from. I'm going to actually turn that around and go, okay, well, before we even look at how we go about changing running technique, why don't we look at why we would want to beforehand. So I guess, many of us are medical professionals and many of you will know this already, but despite the obvious potential benefits of running in terms of physical health and mental well-being, up to 79% of runners suffer at least one running injury each year. And that figure, varies between kind of 30% and 79%, but it's certainly a substantial number of runners suffer from problems each year. More than that, the high recurrence rate of these injuries suggests that traditional regimes of treatment are insufficient for long-term success. And abnormal running mechanics, teamed with the repetitive loading of running, are thought to contribute to many of these injuries. So, I guess, movement retraining has the potential to alter mechanical loads placed on the body, and as coaches and medical professionals, we've been using this approach for quite some time in different realms with different movement dysfunctions or other sports. Potentially with the automatic nature of running gait, alterations in I guess movement retraining might be a little bit more difficult. So unlike sports like tennis and golf, running is not often a sport where there's a great lot of thought put into technique before you go out and go for a run or go for a jog. And perhaps this does relate to the fact that it is a pretty fundamental movement pattern. We all can run. Some of us are lucky enough to be able to play golf. Myself not included in that. But walking, running, it's one of those fundamental things that we can all do. But there's still, coaches and people out there today that really do believe that it's a natural thing, it's a natural movement pattern, and runners will naturally find their best stride as such. Go back to the previous point in terms of all of these running injuries that are out there. Maybe we're not quite hitting the mark there. And I guess it just boils down to many of us are not really taught how to run. We just go out and do it. So I guess before we kind of think too much about the how to run, an effective GAIT retraining program really does demand a thorough clinical running analysis, and as I kind of opened, we have talked a bit about that in the past, and it's been thrown around quite a lot. I'm not going to kind of delve into that too much today, other than to say that it does require it's not just a foot analysis. It does require a whole body integrated approach. And I guess before you can look at running mechanics, first you need to know what to change. So this isn't really the flavour of what I want to talk about today, but it's kind of I guess a couple of key points which leads into it. So good running technique, if we're looking kind of side on from the sagittal plane, we want to make sure that the head is upright and the eyes are looking forward, that the trunk is upright with maybe a slight lean forward, and that we land our foot lands underneath our knee, relatively close to the centre of mass or centre of the body, i.e. they're not overstriding. So you will read out there quite a lot of commentary around landing underneath your centre of mass. I don't know about your thoughts on that, but I actually don't think it's really possible to land underneath the centre of mass unless you are a sprinter. So, certainly that foot underneath the knee is maybe a little bit closer to where it actually happens. No excessive lumbar extension and propulsion largely achieved through hip extension. So we do know that poor sagittal plane form, so if we're looking side on, can increase horizontal braking forces. So what we've got here is a little graph depiction of a horizontal braking force, and we had this runner. I actually made her run with naturally she's a good runner, so just got her up there and told her to do what she normally does, and then I artificially made her run with poor form, and this is typically what we would see. So this first part of the horizontal braking here is the braking forces. So the blue being the poor running form, we see a big spike in the braking forces. So in essence, she's becoming less efficient. She's increasing her braking forces. Overstriding, so stretching out in front of, so your foot is now landing in front of your knee, is also associated with excessive impact forces. So not only do we see these kind of changes in the horizontal forces, we also see them vertically in the impact forces. So if we're thinking frontal plane, so looking from the front or from the rear, we want again an upright trunk with no lateral deviation to either side, and a relatively level pelvis throughout stance, so no contralateral pelvic drop, and relatively straight lines through the hip, knee, and ankle, so no excessive hip or knee valgus as you see up there. So poor frontal plane stability, or poor frontal plane form, has been again linked with running injuries. So medial collapse of the knee and the hip is closely linked with the development of your overuse knee injuries, whether that be patellofemoral or iliotibial band, and also stress fractures of the tibia and even the femur. And there's been quite a lot of research that goes on around that, and we see the changes come out in the vertical impact force in terms of increased impact peaks and also increased loading rate as you go up through here. So if we had a runner who was had good form, typically we wouldn't see this little impact peak here. So we know that the hip abductors and the external rotators are the primary stabilizers of the hip and pelvis during running, and a lot of what I've kind of just taken you through relates back to that area. And as you'll all be well aware, often runners with poor form or injury that present to you have weak hip abductors and external rotators. So obviously, hip strengthening is often prescribed as a means to improve running mechanics. Unfortunately, fortunately, in the short term at least, hip strengthening does appear to be effective for reducing pain, and there's plenty of studies that are out there that have shown that. And while it is a really important precursor to going on to changing mechanics, the evidence suggests that hip strengthening actually has minimal effect on changing mechanics, and that if that's all that you do is strengthen this region, you can't expect to see marked changes in any form of technique. But more recent studies, I guess on the brighter side, more recent studies have shown that with effective GAIT training, we are actually starting to see reduced medial collapse and other reductions in other kind of dysfunctional GAIT mechanics. I do put a little bit of a warning on this. I guess clinically and anecdotally, the GAIT retraining is actually really good. It does seem to, if you work on it, it lasts for quite some time. The research isn't necessarily there to substantiate that in the long term. It's a bit lacking, and most of the studies, are limited to 3 months in terms of follow-up and the changes that have occurred. That's not necessarily saying that the changes don't last for longer than that, but most of this relates back to, short-term studies and poorly funded research, essentially. So I guess that kind of just sets the platform for, why we would want to go beyond maybe, just some basic strengthening, to actually look at GAIT retraining. So I guess the second half of what I'm going to talk about is actually some of the strategies that you can use and you can go about to instill these changes. And I guess it doesn't really matter what we're looking at changing, what the movement is. It's going to come about because of some form of feedback. So some kind of sensory feedback. And you can give a range of cues or simple tasks, that can kind of focus attention or facilitate change in a particular element. What those cues or strategies are will depend on what the problem is, and how the particular runner that you are working with responds to different strategies. Verbal feedback is kind of the obvious go-to, and it doesn't matter really who we are or what profession we're from. Verbal feedback is really the first go-to thing. And it is potentially quite powerful. And just simple phrases like, squeeze your butt, run with your knees apart, and keep your kneecaps pointing straight ahead. Clinically have been seen to be quite successful. And even within the research side of things, they have kind of gone and looked at immediate changes just with verbal feedback, and they've found that they can immediately change how habitual rear foot runners strike the ground, and they can change them to a forefoot running pattern pretty much straight away. So it certainly isn't to be ignored, and as the first go-to thing, it is quite powerful. However, as you will be aware, most runners being sports people, many of them are quite kinesthetic people, and therefore they can struggle with just straight verbal cues. And being told some of these things, if they can't feel it, then they struggle to kind of connect what you're telling them and what's going on in their head with what's actually happening in their legs. So there are other, I guess, auditory feedback mechanisms that we can use that take a more kind of automated form and have the potential to go beyond the bounds of just subjective verbal cues. Most of this seems to have remained within the realm of cadence manipulation, and there's been a bit of research again that's kind of that worked in this area, and they've kind of found that even just increasing step rate using automated cues can lead to some substantial useful reductions in step length, braking impulse, and that some of those the peak vertical ground reaction force and things that I initially said were linked with some of these injuries. So we're kind of moving in a positive direction. When we think manipulating cadence, there's some pretty simple devices out there that we can use, and a lot of the running watches and devices that are out there have cadence measures on them, so it's pretty easy and pretty accessible for most runners that are out there. It has almost taken on a life of its own in certain realms, and to the point of being a little bit of a craze in terms of changing running form. I guess some of the research that's done, instead of using watches and things like that, they've actually used metronomes. That's not to say that you want to send runners out there with your old school kind of piano metronome. Doesn't really work particularly well. But technology's moved well in the last couple of years, and you get your metronome app and you're away laughing. I guess where the craze has taken on is the fact that out of some research, which is where they looked at the step rates of elite level runners, they had kind of come up with this fixed number of at least 180 strides per minute. I guess the reality is that, everyone is different, and trying to put one kind of prescribed number on people is never really going to stack up. But people like solid things, and they're going to grab onto that. So there are, numerous, you go onto iTunes or running websites, and there are numerous metronomes that you can download. There's a huge amount of running specific music, which is tuned to our 180 beats per minute, so that people are kind of keying in on this. But the reality is, most kind of non-elite runners simply really just overstride. So going back to what we were saying before, and that's really the reason, why they might have a low cadence. So yes, sure, using a metronome or increasing cadence is certainly one way for runners to reduce overstriding, but it's certainly not the only way. And prescribing a set number that people want to get to is maybe just a little bit short-sighted. So another popular method of gait retraining is to break the running stride down into segments and to do drills to improve each of those segments. And certainly drills can be useful for reinforcing the important components of running gait. And since the body is working as a whole, the drills do mimic visually what's happening when you're running. So they can be a very useful strategy. However, one thing that you need to key in on is that running mechanics takes two forms. It takes the active mechanics, i.e. our muscles actively contracting, but there's also a lot of passive mechanics that go on in terms of the stretch shorten cycle, stretch reflex, and the elastic return that we get from our tendons and our muscles being stretched. So drills don't necessarily key in on that and reinforce those passive mechanics, and they can be just as important as the active mechanics. So kind of separating the two out maybe is not always the best strategy. And hence, ensuring that there is sufficient work done on actual technique when you are, in your full running stride is also really important. Visual feedback. Visual feedback is probably one of the most powerful senses. We are kind of visual beings. We tend to believe what we see over and above anything else. And it has been hugely successful in modifying technique. Unfortunately, visual feedback, it's kind of hard to run along, especially, it is possible indoors on a treadmill to run along with a screen in front of you where you can look at your own technique. But that's pretty much impossible outdoors. So it is largely limited to post-run feedback, which we do know kind of limits motor feedback. So if you are if you're not giving immediate feedback and there's delay in that, then the learning and the crossover is not going to be quite as great. Simple strategies, so going back to the real basic stuff, has again been shown to be really successful. So again, going real time here, using real time visual feedback, whether it's using a video or in the case with the research study here, just using mirror feedback, has actually been shown to relate to significant reductions in excessive medial collapse and some of those dysfunctional gait mechanics, in as little as kind of 8 sessions. And I think this is an area to watch in terms of real-time feedback. We're in a world now, it's a digital environment. There's all kinds of apps and software packages that are now free downloads and things like that, or, small price, which enables you to, to maybe take the step up from just straight mirror feedback. And kind of probably one of the biggest things, in terms of gait retraining, and obviously you'll see that outside as soon as you walk out into the foyer there, shoes are huge. And since, Nike introduced the freeze back in 2005, the running community has become obsessed with the barefoot minimalist running phenomenon. And I guess it's founded in the principle that, that reducing the cushioning of shoes increases our proprioceptive feedback, so it starts, honing in on a different sensory feedback that we haven't worked on. And essentially, if you run and you overstride with poor running mechanics, it'll hurt. So, causes pain or discomfort, and that's our internal cue to change our technique. And there's been some pretty big and bold claims around, barefoot and minimalist footwear, that it leads to improved technique and it increases foot strength and it will, reduce your injuries. It's an educated audience. You well know that just because you slip on a different pair of shoes, or in fact you take off your shoes altogether, does not necessarily translate to improved technique. It might be a strategy that can be useful, but it's not going to straight away lead to that. And there's been some, pretty big lawsuit cases in the States around some of the brands for, making these claims. I guess there has been a lot of research in this area as well. Again, some of it quite prominent. So here's Daniel Lieberman's studies out of Harvard that were published in Nature, and this has kind of fueled the fire a little bit. But it seems like for every study that comes out that supports this phenomenon, there's another one that refutes it and claims that it's relating to increased injuries. And I don't know what you guys have seen clinically, but that certainly stacks up with what I've seen as well in terms of it is a strategy that works for some people, but for other people who maybe haven't engaged in actually improving their technique in line with changing their footwear, it can actually increase injuries like metatarsal stress fractures and things like that, where there's more stress going on to structures, which maybe haven't had it in the past. So it can be a very useful way of providing internal cues in terms of running technique. Doesn't automatically result in technique change. There is an increased risk of injuries, so it always should be in the back of your mind. Are you, what are you doing around, are you really sure that it's right for this individual? And obviously with anything, we want to be, recommending an appropriate transition period, through this. It shouldn't just be, here's your new shoes, go and do your marathon long run this weekend and you'll be fine. I think, and talking with, encourage you to talk with some of the sponsors out there, because I think that the best thing that's come out of this little bit of a craze around the barefoot minimalist thing is just the pure options in terms of footwear that's out there. So the shoes that are on display today are vastly different to what you would have had on display 2-3 years ago. So we're looking at new materials, new construction techniques, and new arrangements within the shoes. So what it's meant for the runners that are out there is that there's just huge options for them. And so learn what's out there, and these can become a really kind of key strategy that you can use, but they shouldn't be, the only thing that you hone in on. And I guess as the final thing, really it's a lot of this, what we've talked about, there are immediate changes that can happen. It's pretty easy, as kind of the first verbal cue slide indicated, that you can tell someone to squeeze their butt and keep their kneecaps pointing straight ahead, and you can make some changes pretty much straight away. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that. If we're thinking about reducing injuries and improving technique for the years coming on, we need to have ingrained changes, and this is where things get a little bit more complex. And I guess we want to be able take away those cues ultimately and ensure that the runners that are out there are honing in on their own kind of internal cues and feelings. I think some of the things that I've learned over the last little while is that speed is really important for this kind of ingraining period. It needs to be a moderate speed, so it can't just be a plod where you don't get, the influence of those passive mechanical stretches and things like that. If you're working on ingraining, you've got to encompass everything that is running. So it can't just be drills and things like that. Can't be too fast because then you fatigue too quickly. And if your runner is struggling to focus on their technique, it's probably better off that they slow down and walk, and then go back up to a moderate speed rather than just slow down and plod and actually start reinforcing the poor techniques that they've had in the past. If you've got a competitive athlete, it's also important that you take it to the next step. So it's no use, if you've created these great changes in the training environment, but in 2 months' time they're going to go and run a race. You've got to be able to make sure that they can transfer those internal cues into a slightly fatigued or slightly more stressful environment. There are quite a few unanswered questions out there still. I certainly don't have all of the answers. There's some really complex stuff going on around foot strike, loading rates, the contributions of the passive and active mechanics. We still really don't know, the most effective way to provide feedback to runners. We've got all of these strategies that work in different ways for different individuals, and maybe that is the answer. And despite the promise, really, as I suggested earlier, the evidence for GAIT retraining is still limited. It's got great, clinical reinforcement, but the research is still lacking, and therefore I do kind of suggest that you have always taken a critical mind. And when you see things like 180 beats per minute for everyone, maybe that is something that you need to question a little bit before you employ it. I guess some key points. Be careful you don't just focus on one thing. A shotgun approach is not always a bad thing, but remember, don't overload your athletes. Just because you've got all these strategies in your head doesn't mean that they can cope with all of those. So 1 to 2 things at a time for them to focus on is more than substantial. Different strategies work for different people, it seems. Strengthening, as I said, is a really important precursor, but it's not going to translate across to changes in run form. And ultimately, probably the most important thing after I've spent like half an hour talking about GAIT retraining is that it really isn't for everyone. It takes a lot of effort and engagement and focus by the runner themselves to change all of this over a long period of time. If they're not interested or engaging in that, it's a waste of everyone's time. So you need to kind of make those decisions as you go along the way, and really, I guess, get buy-in from your runners before you try and impart too much on them. There's heaps of stuff happening in terms of future directions, in terms of biofeedback. Many of you will have seen the Google glasses that are coming out. There was another kind of set called Recon that are coming out from Vancouver in Canada. They just launched them last weekend, which are going to enable basically heads-up display of whatever you want. So we've got smartphone technology paired with this kind of stuff. It's going to start moving pretty quickly. So while you've got your critical mind on, still be open to the technology and the advances that are out there, and start hunting out things and get creative and come up with your own kind of strategies and see what works really. Yeah.